Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for those on the phone line as well. My name is Bob Ferguson, Attorney General for the state of Washington. First, let me introduce a few folks who you'll be hearing from shortly. Of course, Governor Jay Inslee. He'll be speaking after I speak to my right. Feel free to step in a little closer. Senator Karen Kaiser, who's the prime sponsor of the Senate bill related to additional protections for Hanford workers that we'll be talking about. She's been a real legislative leader on this issue. Tom Carpenter from Hanford Challenge, who you've seen here at our press conferences related to Hanford issues, will speak after the senator. And then Lynn Dodson from the Washington State Labor Council will be speaking as well. There's a few folks from my legal team who are here who may be assisting with answers to questions. That includes Noah Purcell, my Solicitor General, who you all know, Lionel Greaves to my left. Lionel's the division chief in charge of the labor industries, the L&I division in our office, so giving advice to our clients. And Anastasia Sandstrom is an Assistant Attorney General who works with Lionel in our office as well. You know, we've had press conferences here in the past about issues related to Hanford and specifically around worker safety issues at Hanford. I think the folks here are very familiar with that. There have been many reports about the dangers, the unique dangers that Hanford workers have working at the tank farms and at Hanford. We're here today to talk about is a very unfortunate lawsuit filed against the state of Washington, challenging a state law passed in the last session that gives Hanford workers easier access to the benefits they deserve if they become ill because of their work at Hanford. This lawsuit, we believe, is based on incorrect interpretation of the interaction between state and federal law. As Attorney General, it's my job, of course, to defend the laws that the state legislature puts in place. That's our role. We are 16-0 against this Department of Justice. We are confident in our ability to successfully defend this litigation that's been filed in federal court in the Eastern District of Washington. So just a brief background on the legislation. In 2017, Representative Larry Haler of Richland, working with Senator Kaiser, introduced legislation, as I mentioned, to assist Hanford workers who become ill in accessing worker compensation benefits when they're found to have certain illnesses associated with their work at Hanford. We're really sorry Representative Haler couldn't be here today. The Senator and I were chatting. He's just been a great champion, but obviously on short notice, so we regret he couldn't make it over in time to join us today. My office and many others, the folks here today, supported that legislation back in 2017, but unfortunately it did not pass. Thankfully, Senator Kaiser, Representative Haler came back again, and the legislation did pass as House Bill 1723 last year with a team effort of a lot of folks to make that happen. So before this bill was passed, Hanford workers suffering from an illness related to their job had to prove that whatever illness they had was not caused by something else in their lives. And that could turn out to be a long, bureaucratic fight. Some Hanford workers did not live to see and gain the benefits they most certainly deserve because of that lengthy process. Now, as a result of this legislation, when a Hanford worker who suffers from one of a wide range of illnesses that we know could be linked to tank vapors, such as chronic beryllium or respiratory or neurological diseases, there is a presumption that that worker became ill because of exposure at work. The federal government can try and rebut that presumption, but the presumption is in favor of the worker. This is not unique in Washington state law. Firefighters, for example, and first responders have similar presumptions in their favor, and those are established in Washington state law. Importantly, there was ample public process because this legislation went through 2 different legislative sessions. Very public, Hanford issue. We had litigation going on against the federal government during this time. Throughout that process, the federal government never participated or raised any concerns with this legislation at all. We first heard of their concerns in a letter on October 31st. My legal team had a call with them yesterday to discuss the federal government's concerns, tried to clarify what appears to be a misunderstanding of federal and Washington state law. The federal government chose to go ahead and file this lawsuit anyway. We believe that Congress has given authority to the states to provide workers compensation benefits to injured contractors on federal lands, the situation we have here. We believe Washington has fully complied with this law. And just before I turn over to the governor, I'll just say that, like a lot of folks here, I've spent a lot of time working on issues related to Hanford, the cleanup and worker safety at Hanford. There have been reports after reports after reports, year after year after year, focused on the unique dangers at Hanford, the vapors that workers are exposed to, and the serious illness that many, many workers have experienced. The federal government ignored those reports. The federal government ignored their own experts. The federal government ignored those sick workers. It is ironic to me that in their complaint, I think it's paragraph 4 of their complaint, they say, I'm quoting that, their top priority, the federal government, their top priority is protecting workers at Hanford. That is ironic. It took a lawsuit from this office, supported by the people here behind me, to change the culture of what's going on at the federal government in terms of protecting workers. When we filed that lawsuit, the federal government argued that I could not bring the lawsuit because not enough workers were getting sick for me to bring a lawsuit on behalf of the workers here in Washington State. They resisted us at every turn. And now this. So the good news is we have great legislators, we have great advocates, we have a great governor, we have a great legal team who are going to do everything we can to defend this state law that we think does so much to help Hanford workers. With that, I'm going to turn over to our governor, Jay Inslee. Thank you very much, Governor, by the way, for being here. We know how busy you are. Thank you for being here, Governor.
Well, I'm here as governor to fight for some of our hardest working people in the state of Washington. That's our workers at Hanford. And I know this for sure. The people who fought communism shouldn't have to fight their federal government to get the health care that they deserve. And we all ought to be irate that yet again, the Trump administration is trying to take away health care from people in the state of Washington. And of all the people that we ought to respect and give health care to, it ought to be the people at Hanford. I know these folks. They were my neighbors. My neighbor worked at Hanford. I represented them in Congress. And I can tell you that they exposed themselves to dangerous chemicals. They exposed themselves sometimes to radioactivity. And they worked darn hard to provide our security. And right now it's outrageous that yet again this president's trying to take away health care from the people of the state of Washington. Now, we shouldn't be shocked that the president's administration has got something wrong. It's kind of happened a few times here so far in the last couple of years, but we ought to be darn disappointed. And I'm glad that we got a great attorney general and senators, and Lynn Dodson particularly, who is a great leader on this, to do something that's common sense. Look, when you've got people that work around these dangerous chemicals, it's fair to put the burden on the federal government to prove that their problem was not associated with their work. These people carried a burden for decades to provide for our freedom and our security. It is now fair to put the burden on federal government to show they're not sick because of an occupational illness. That's the right thing to do. And this was a carefully crafted piece of legislation, and it's doing the right thing for our workers. And I'm glad we're going to keep fighting it all the way. Thanks.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Attorney General Robinson. It is amazing to me that the federal government is trying to take away sure and certain relief, which is the mission of workers' compensation to injured workers. If you had sat through the hearings that we held over the last 2 years, listening to the injured workers who could hardly keep their sentences together because of the neurological damage they were suffering from their bodies hardly being able to function and their brains really not doing well. You know that sure and certain relief had not happened for these workers. And we were insistent, and this was a bipartisan effort from both chambers. We were insistent that sure and certain relief would be given to Hanford workers. And I'm still insisting on that. And I don't know what outcome this lawsuit will have, but we'll go back to Olympia and thread any needle we need to thread, because those workers are not going to lose the workers' compensation health coverage that they have a right to have to live out their lives. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tom Carpenter. I'm Executive Director of Hanford Challenge. We work with Hanford workers. We testified in favor of this bill, and proud to be here to support the state and the governor, and thank you very much for supporting this. In March of this year, the legislature passed a very, very important bill to protect these workers at the Hanford site, the most contaminated site in the United States. It's got decades and decades of histories of contaminating workers. It's a very unsafe work environment. And the systems that have been in place to get worker compensation for these folks is broken, and has been broken, has been shown to have been broken. So for instance, there have been many complaints to the Inspector General, to the state labor and industries, about how these programs and systems have failed these workers over and over again. And just as for a few examples, the Inspector General just recently, within the last year, put out a report saying that the systems at the Hanford site for delivering worker compensation care were failing. This was a report done at the request of Senators Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell. Toxic substances at the Hanford site include radioactive materials, chemicals. Many of these can cause damage in very, very tiny quantities, and the damage can occur 10 and 20 years later. Nobody is measuring this. Nobody knows when you've been exposed to a piece of asbestos or a particle of plutonium, and yet that is the burden that workers are supposed to carry when they get sick and go to worker compensation court. Hanford has fought these kind of cases for all these years, and successfully so. This now, by changing the burdens of proof and saying, look, you worked at Hanford, you got exposed, there is a presumption of causation that your illness came from there. And obviously there is an opportunity for the government to rebut these presumptions, et cetera, but now we do have workers finally getting the justice that they require and that they need. We're very proud that this has happened over the many decades of denials and fights. I just want to say in conclusion that Hanford Challenge stands with the state of Washington, Local 598, the governor, in protecting this very, very important bill, and shame on the Trump administration for taking this action. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Lynn Dodson, Secretary-Treasurer of the Washington State Labor Council, AFL-CIO. We represent over 450,000 union members across the state, and we stand with the workers at Hanford and with Governor Inslee, our state legislature, and Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Thank you for doing the right thing. We are astounded that the Trump administration is spending our tax dollars to try to deny workers' compensation to those workers who suffer from occupational diseases contracted while they were working to clean up one of the most contaminated sites in the nation. Before the Washington State Legislature took bipartisan action to fix our laws, workers at Hanford had to make their workers' comp cases blindfolded with one hand behind their backs. That's because the chemicals they're exposed to are unknown. The Department of Energy either can't or won't say what's making these workers sick. Over 1,500 chemicals are in the airspace these workers spend their days cleaning up in. And they're getting sick. They're suffering from respiratory diseases, cancer, beryllium disease. Their bosses wouldn't listen. The federal government wouldn't listen. Their company doctors wouldn't listen. So they turned to their state. They convinced Democrats. They convinced Republicans. They showed up day after day, year after year, and convinced the rest of us that they are suffering. And they forged a bipartisan path. Republicans and Democrats came together to solve this problem. They said that these workers, who are cleaning up decades worth of nuclear waste, are going to get the benefit of the doubt. In Washington State, we're going to assume that certain cancers and medical conditions that are common to these workers, specific to these workers, are going to be treated unless the companies can prove otherwise. It's the right thing to do. It's the only just and decent thing to do. It doesn't make these workers healthy again, but allows them to live with some measure of economic security. It's the least we can do for these women and men who put their lives on the line to clean up this mess. Yet the Trump administration is proving once again that the lives and well-being of workers are not important to them. If they want to reduce workers' compensation costs, there are more efficient and effective ways to do so, rather than hiring lawyers and suing the state of Washington. They could invest in engineers to design safer facilities. They could invest in safety inspectors to ensure an environment that's safe to work in. They could invest in researchers to examine exactly what chemicals are in the air, disclose that information, and mitigate the danger. They could invest in early detection and treatment. But no, instead, Donald Trump and Rick Perry would kick these workers while they're down. It just goes to show how hard these workers really have it. We will not stand for the treatment of our women and men who spend their lives cleaning up the Hanford Reservation. The Washington State Labor Council and its 450,000 members across the state is proud to stand with our sisters and brothers at Hanford, and we're proud to stand with Governor Inslee and Attorney General Ferguson as they pick up the torch to shed light on this injustice. Thank you.
Lynn, thank you so much. And one thing I just will add before we take your questions is Lynn mentioned Republicans, Democrats coming together. I can't remember, Tom, how long ago it was, but there was a town hall, one of a few we've been to, but it was several years ago now, as I recall, where workers spoke. And I remember Representative Haler was there, other legislators on both sides of the aisle were there, and it was an opportunity for workers to just speak about what they were experiencing. And I know from speaking to, for example, Representative Haler after that he was moved by that testimony for sure, as was, you could not be moved by what was going on in that room. And I think that really helped. Lynn, I'm glad you focused on the workers really sort of speaking up, speaking out, and saying, hey, we need to make some changes. And, I guess I just wish that whoever's making this decision back at the federal government to file this lawsuit would listen to those workers. I just wish they'd take the time to do that. Everybody here has done that. I wish they'd do that. And look, the hostility towards the working men and women of this state that this litigation represents is so deeply disappointing. We just all want the working men and women of Hanford to know that we will use every tool we have here in my office to defend this legislation that folks work so hard on, and look forward to your questions. And by the way, for those on the phone, I'll try to repeat the question so you can hear, and we'll take some here, and I'll see if anyone on the phone would like to have a question. Yes, go right ahead.
Yes, sir. Have there been any other cases you're aware of involving a supremacy clause claim by the federal government with workers' compensation cases?
So the question is, has there been a case like this? Is there a similar case like this? You mean sort of anywhere, basically, or around the country?
Yeah, this is not a case of first
None in
impression
this
with
state.
regard to supremacy and
Yeah.
whatnot.
So I'm going to turn to Noah.
Not in this state.
There has been,
Do you want to come to the microphone,
sure.
Anastasia? Yeah. If you,
there has been a U.S. Supreme Court case that considered whether there could be workers' compensation cases from the federal government, and the U.S. Supreme Court said there could be, that states could regulate it. And that's yes, I could. It's Goodyear Atomic Energy versus Miller.
So, and we'll make sure, Brianna can make sure we get a reference to that case out. You bet, yeah.
The basis of their challenge here?
Well, we just received the complaint yesterday. Is that a fair enough, a short answer? Yes, yeah. And so again, we literally just received the complaint, and it's worth pointing out when I was chatting with the team earlier today and yesterday is, even in the phone calls that we've had in the past, the legal teams had with the federal government, they've not discussed in any detail what their arguments are. So really, the complaint showed those arguments really for the first time. Yeah, but it is essentially based in that way, yes.
So aside from the supremacy clause of the Constitution, what statute are they pointing to say it's in conflict with the state law?
Do you guys, so the question goes, is there a statute? Anastasia will try that one again. If you don't mind repeating that question, Anastasia, and see if you can answer it.
We asked that question to the federal government representatives, and they said they weren't relying on a statute. They were relying on the supremacy clause. They do mention in their complaint 40 U.S.C. Section 1371, which provides that states can provide workers' compensation claims, but they minimize it in their complaint.
Anastasia, would you spell your last name for
Oh,
everybody?
yes,
Anastasia's an attorney in my office, works in the L&I division. If you could just spell your last name.
Sure,
for
it's
everybody.
SANDSTROM.
Sandstrom, yes, thank you. Great. Sorry, first Essex, and we'll come over. Yeah, go right ahead.
Should the federal government be successful, what does this mean for firefighters and others who have similar provisions in state
So the question is, for those on the phone, is if the federal government was to be successful with this litigation, which we do not think they would be, would there be implications for firefighters or first responders? The reference I had in the speaking points to other state laws. Anybody want to?
Well, I would just, workers' compensation.
Senator, do you want to come to the microphone? Yeah.
Industrial insurance, also known as workers' compensation, is a state law. It's over 100 years old in this state, and it applies to all workers in the state, and it's called workers' compensation, which will provide, quote, sure and certain relief. There isn't a federal workers' compensation system as far as I know. They are state programs.
And yeah, so that was Senator Kaiser for those on the phone, Governor Inslee, and then Lionel from my office will follow up as well. Governor?
This question about the supremacy clause, look, the only thing supreme about here is this supreme indifference to the health of working people. And they are supremely indifferent to that. Look, they're not trying to replace the state workers' compensation system with some federal system. They just want to tell the workers at Hanford to go hang. You're on your own. They're not trying to substitute a federal system for our protection net for these hardworking peoples. They just want to kick people off health care, period. And frankly, one of the things so frustrating is they've also tried to do that for several 100,000 other people who are today protected by health care reform. They've also tried to kick off health care. Now, I don't understand why you have a president every morning gets up and tries to figure out how to kick people off health care in the state of Washington. To me, that does not make sense.
Lionel?
Sure. So Lionel Greaves, I'm the division chief for L&I. To answer your question, firefighters, law enforcement, most of those folks within the state are county or state employees, so the federal aspect of this, the supremacy clause, would not generally be applicable to those folks. We have had that presumption in place for a number of years. It has not been challenged in the same way, and I don't think we anticipate a similar challenge to those folks.
Susanna?
Well, one of my questions, well, I know no one up here is probably a mind reader, but people that have heard about this are saying, gosh, why would they want to do that? I mean, they say that safety is the #1 priority. Why would they want to do that? Does anyone want to give an educated guess on what would be a motivating factor?
So the question is, from Susanna, is acknowledge, while none of us can read the minds of who's making the decision, the federal government, why would they do this? What might be motivating them? I'm happy to, I guess, give it a shot, and at least from my perspective, now having spent, like the folks here, a lot of time thinking about what's going on in Hanford, a lot of time, and it is impossible to know, but you know, it's I think it's only fair to point out, and we all gave very truncated versions of the long, tortured history at Hanford when it comes to worker safety issues, but this is not a, you know, it's not a coincidence, right? When you have a series of actions or inactions. What I find so disappointing about this particular action, and I think it's hard for issues at Hanford, the federal government, to find something that's even more disappointing than what they've done before, but it's bad enough to have a culture of indifference to worker safety at Hanford. That's bad enough. But let's be honest, any organization can have a culture that's not a good culture, and it's hard to change that, right? So it's one thing to ignore reports. It's one thing to not take action when you see suffering. It is another thing, okay, to proactively take an action, to the governor's point, right, to proactively take an action to try and stop something that the state of Washington has done to give additional protections for these workers who face unique challenges there. I mean, that is, someone had to sit around a table and say, yeah, we're going to file a lawsuit against those guys. We're not going to put up with that. You know, that is a different kind of action. And so, you know, what's the line in the movie? Once is happenstance, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. I'm afraid I might be quoting a James Bond movie, to be perfectly honest. But there is, but you're right. It's something like that, right? It's but I mean, there's some truth to that, right?
Yeah.
Right? Once, okay. Twice, yeah. Okay. Well, hey, we're way past 3 times when it comes to Hanford workers. We're way past that, and so it's not an answer, obviously, Susanna, to your question. I think that's unanswerable, but I have thought about the fact that this is a different type of response or action from the federal government than simply inaction, which is bad enough. Governor, anything you want to add on that?
I think Bob has been much too kind. And so maybe I'll try to fill in a little bit. Look, this is a depraved action by an administration whose record of depravity in reducing people's health care and protection against toxicity is continuous. And this is just one piece of a puzzle of attacking people's health, health care, environmental quality, clean air laws, clean water laws, effort to protect us against massive climate change problems. This is just one piece of a very, very disturbing puzzle. And it's just consistent with that. So what you can say is, from whatever motivation it is, they do it almost every day. And Washingtonians' health is being adversely affected by this. Look, we're trying to fight the catastrophic effects of forest fires and climate change and asthma. And this president's trying to strip our protections of that. We're protecting hundreds of thousands of people today in Medicare, and this president's trying to literally take that away. We're trying to, we have today provisions on the book to reduce toxicity discharges into water, and this president's trying to eliminate those. So it is a dark source of this. It's consistent, and thank goodness we got good leadership in the legislature on a bipartisan basis, and a really, really active group of attorney generals who deserve a pay raise.
Anybody else want to add to that question? If not, yes. Why don't we do this? Why don't we see if there's anyone on the phone who has a quick question, if that's okay. And we'll be available afterwards as well. But anyone on the phone, I know it's hard on the phone, easy to speak over each other, but if you don't mind identifying yourself, if you have a question, we're happy to try and answer it before we wrap up.
Mr. Attorney General, it's Joel Connolly from Seattle, PI. I am interested what the Fed's interest is in filing this suit. Are they afraid of Washington setting a precedent? Do they want to establish some sort of precedent themselves in terms of their control over their workforce? What is their selfish interest in filing this suit?
So Joel's question, I think folks heard here, is what do we think the interest is of the federal government in filing this suit? Are they trying to set a precedent? I'm not sure I've got Joel, a better answer than I just gave to Suzanne in terms of what's motivating the federal government. But I'm going to open up to anyone else who, Tom Carpenter, Joel, is going to take a shot at that. Tom.
Hey, Joel, Tom Carpenter here. So I watch Hanford every day of my life. I've talked to a lot of Hanford workers, and I've watched this system in action. And Hanford is allergic to accountability. And it just doesn't want to take accountability for the environmental condition it's created. And right now they're trying to escape the consequences of, for instance, cleaning up the high-level waste out there by relabeling that waste. But the Attorney General, the Local 598 at the Hanford site, union there, and Hanford Challenge spent 3 years litigating to try to, persuade a judge and to get Hanford to protect its workers from these harmful chemical vapors. And we ended up just recently resolving that suit with a settlement. We got everything we wanted in that settlement, but it shouldn't have taken a lawsuit and millions of dollars, et cetera, to get us there. But I just lay that out as an example. There are, and I think you hit the nail on the head, one aspect of this, Joel, is that the government is worried about precedents, that they may have to actually pay for the injuries and illnesses that they've caused at the Hanford site. Tens of thousands of people have worked out there. This cleanup is going to proceed for another 50 to 100 years. So there's tens of thousands of people coming down the pike, potentially exposed to these materials, and they're looking at the price tag on that, and their hair is standing on end. If they were more careful with how they handled these materials, and they wouldn't have as many cases, of course, that they have to recompense. But I think that's part of it. There's the issue of this isn't the only site that the Department of Energy has, and other states may sit up and take notice what Washington is doing here and saying, hey, maybe we need the same kind of remedy in our state as well.
So you're saying it's about money?
I think it's partly about money, but I think it's partly about culture and not taking accountability.
Okay. So we're going to wrap it up there. The governor and others have, I've got a plane to catch myself, but a few of us will hang around afterwards. We appreciate everybody on the line who stayed on. Look, I just want to thank everybody who's joined us here today. Suzanne, you want to last?
Can we just quickly find out what's next?
How about, what you have to do? What's next? Well, we can briefly, legally, so we will be answering the complaint filed in the Eastern District of Washington. If I did not mention, this is filed in federal court in the Eastern District of Washington. So the next move will be in our court, and this seems unlikely, to put it mildly, to be a case that would be settling, right? This will be a case that'll get resolved by a federal trial court judge, and of course, then you have a legal process from there.
And the law remains in effect.
Okay.
These individuals are still covered, and I'll just tell you, if in fact the lawsuit doesn't go our way, we will have new law that makes these workers protected by their from their occupational diseases.
So we haven't lost yet against the Department of Justice, and as I like to say, we don't plan on starting now. So thank you so much, everybody being here. Really appreciate it. Governor, thanks.